Hey, what's up guys? Talon back with a new video. We're testing out a little bit of Starfield today, and I'm using a 12100F, that's an i3 12100F Intel CPU. It's a Alder Lake generation CPU with 4 cores and 8 threads. So basically it's kind of like an old school i7 that had, the quad cores with hyper-threading. I do have that B clock overclocked to 5.1 gigahertz, and you can see that in the top left corner. If you look up here, you can see the P core clock. Now, this CPU obviously doesn't have any E cores. It's just 4 P cores hyper-threaded. It doesn't have E cores, and I think it runs at a peak turbo frequency of 4.3 gigahertz. I think all core is 4.0 gigahertz or 4 gigahertz. But with my motherboard, and there are certain motherboards out there that can do it, you can BCLK overclock the CPU. So that's what I've done. I believe the cache is running at like 4.6 or 7 gigahertz. The core P cores are running at 5.1 all core, so it's just going to hold that. And then I believe I've got the memory set to 6400 CL30. It's 8 eyes, so pretty tuned up. I haven't tested this at stock to see what it can do, but my motherboard, all of my motherboards that I have, all allow for BCLK overclocking of locked chip. So basically, it's instead of tuning the multiplier on the CPU, you just tune the BCLK. You can set the ratios to what you want first, then set the BCLK, and it does not. It's not like, I know there's people out there like, you can't do that. It affects your hard drive and your SSD, and that's like way old school. That hasn't happened since Skylake. The clocks are independent. They don't change your PCI Express clock or anything like that. These are all independent clocks at this point. It's kind of like, I think like the first gen i7s, when they first had the first i7K CPU, the 875K, you had the multiplier and you also had the B clock. You could do either overclocking you wanted to do, but then the ratios all affect each other. The memory ratio, the CPU core ratio, the cache ratio, all of it affects each other. So you basically just, if you turn one dial, you have to turn the other dial to get what you want, right? So I'm just running this at 40x or 37x on the multiplier, and then I'm using, I think it's 135 or 37 or whatever it is. You do the math with your calculator to get yourself to 5.1 gigahertz, and then I left the cache on defaults, and then the memory ratio, I just go to the memory drop down and I just select the speed that I want, and then it's going to run at the same multiplier that the CPU is running at as well, or B clock, and then that gets you to, you just adjust that to get to the clock you want. So you basically just take the multiplier times the ratio, and that's how you get it for everything: your memory, your core, and your cache. It's really not difficult. If you used 100 BCLK, which is standard, and you went 64 on the memory ratio, that would give you 6400 megahertz, right, or mega transfers. With this, if you had 130 and you went times 64, you would obviously run a super high memory speed that you wouldn't be able to use. So you use a lower ratio and it gets you the same. It's the same thing. It's just a different way of getting the same performance. It changes nothing. The output is the same. So it doesn't matter how you get there to the frequency. If you use 100 strap or use 125 or 150 or whatever, as long as the end result target frequency is the same, it doesn't make a difference. So now that that's out of the way, and hopefully people understand that's how it works, we can move on. So anyways, moving into the settings here, we're using an i3. It's an RTX 4080 Tough Edition. I have a slight overclock on it just to make up for the fact that I'm recording this with Shadowplay at 4K with 110 bit rate, so super high bit rate affects the performance just a little bit. Ultra settings 4K. We're using DLSS right now instead of FSR. I'm using PureDark's mod. And then everything's on ultra. The only thing I've turned off are film grain, depth of field, and motion blur. You can see that here. I just don't like those, and they're turned off because of that. You can see down here we're not using frame generation yet. We're just using replace FSR2 with DLSS, and we do have reflex enabled. That's in this mod. So just running around here in New Atlantis, you can see that the GPU is pretty much maxed out, 98% up there in the top left corner. Having no issues running this game with an i3, which is actually insane. Also recording this. And New Atlantis being one of the more difficult places to run. There are maybe some more difficult places, but we're just going to use this for the time being. You can see it's just, I mean, it's buttery smooth. I mean, it's an RTX 4080 maxed out at 100% render resolution with DLSS, which means we're running DLAA right now. This lady behind me. You would get more frames, obviously, if you weren't in this, you know, more difficult place to run. But it's just what it is. But it's buttery smooth, all synced up with a G-Sync display. I'm running this on an OLED. And no issues maxing out the 4080. Yeah, it's basically the same performance as when I was using a 13900K, because again we're maxing out the 4080 pretty much to its max. So really no difference between the two CPUs in this configuration once it's B-clock overclocked, right? Alright, so now we're going to go ahead and we're going to turn on frame generation. That's going to take a second for it to spool up. That's how it works. Frame generation is enabled. And now we're up to about 90 frames per second with everything maxed out. Again, just using an i3. This is why frame generation is pretty cool technology that I hope that they eventually bring to the game for both AMD and NVIDIA. Maybe, well, it'll also work for Intel as well, because apparently AMD's solution is going to work for NVIDIA and AMD and Intel. It is basically going to work on any hardware. How good that's going to be, we don't really know yet, because we don't have any games yet. If it relies on FSR2 and you have to use FSR2 upscaling to use FSR3 frame generation, I'm not too optimistic about that, and that's simply because I don't really like FSR2, especially in this game, and really in like any games. If you have no other option, if that's your only upscaler available, then sure, I guess go ahead and use it if you need the performance. But I mean, it just doesn't look very good. It fizzles a lot. It ghosts a lot, especially when you move around the character. You'll get that trailing ghost. And the fizzles, and then so when you move in motion, especially around foliage and things like that, the FSR will fizzle, and it causes like almost a blurry image, and so it's kind of annoying. All right, so we'll transfer over here to the residential district. I'll show you guys no issue traversing to a new area. Again, just with an i3, which is actually just insane. Still getting pretty good frames per second, mostly maxing out the GPU. We're at, what, 97%, 96, 97. So pretty much maxing it out with everything on basically the highest preset it'll go to.
I think I'm going to try it out.
And it hasn't had any issues. No frame stuttering, no hitching, no stutters, no issues traversing areas. Just buttery smooth. And so, like, if you were stuck with like maybe you have an i7 7700K overclocked, or maybe you still have an 8700K 6-core overclocked, or 9900K, so you wouldn't have any trouble running this game. You don't have to have the latest and greatest CPU as long as you're able to access this frame generation and have a really good gaming experience. You know, everything just feels buttery smooth. It's really, really nice. So let's see if we can come down in resolution scale here. It's 50 or 100%. We're going to drop it to 50. Okay, and we're going to see if the frames will go up. Are we bottlenecked yet? Okay, so frame generation is going to turn back on.
Black licorice fan myself.
Okay, so we're up around 117 frames. Still at 4K. Still recording. And we're still getting over 100 frames per second with the i3. You know, all because of frame generation. And this is in a pretty busy area. If we go inside here, we're up to 130, 135 frames per second. So not obviously quite as good as what I was seeing with a 13900K, but a 13900K is obviously a lot more expensive. Now, you don't have to have an expensive motherboard to V-clock, overclock, lock parts anymore. You can actually pick up, go back to the spaceport here, you can actually pick up a B760 Riptide or a B760 from MSI that also BCLK overclocks. Or you could get you could pick up a Z7 or Z690 from ASRock. They're I think it's the Velocity PG that I also have in my closet. That'll be clock overclock, and it'll do the same thing. Then you'll have a Z board. You can run any Z chips in it, have more access to future support, I guess, if you want future chips. You want to put a K chip in later. But you can see we're running around here in the main area now, over 100 frames, with just no issues at all. Today they released Star Wars Frame Generation DLSS 3 as well. That just got released this morning, so that was an AMD only sponsored title. Looks like they're backtracking on that and finally adding in frame generation support and DLSS support as well. And I've seen those B760 boards on sale for like $120 recently. You can pick up this chip for like $100 or something on the internet. So for like, you know, $230, you can put this CPU and motherboard together if you just want to play this game or some other games and do some B-clock, overclocking. It's really up to you. I don't totally advise it. This is more of a demonstration. I use these chips just for overclocking or tuning as a hobby. Just to see what they could do in the past. So I had them in my closet. I thought I would test them out for you guys, just to demonstrate that even with an i3, which is 4 cores and 8 threads, with frame generation on, you can power through this game no problem. And now we're going to drop it down to low settings just to see basically as high as FPS as we can get. So there's low. And frame generation's kicking back on, and we're now at about 138 frames per second in this really busy area. So it even scaled up even further. Still running at 130 frames. Still buttery smooth. No issues. 140, 44, 150. See if we go inside. So out in the open, it's going to play much nicer. Still at 140 frames per second. 150. I haven't had a single hitch or stutter with this thing. It's crazy. 146, 140. Absolutely no issues. Almost 150 frames there. 152, one up to there, 155. Alright, so you guys kind of get the point. It's basically a very smooth experience. It still looks pretty good. I normally use auto HDR as well to make the game look better, but it looks really terrible in recording, so I turned it off for this video. Up to 160 there. And we'll go back to, let's check out the commercial district. You can see it loads right in. No hitching, no stuttering, no crashing, no issues at all playing this with an i3 and frame generation. Even in this commercial district, we're running at 140 frames per second. Pretty impressive stuff. Alright guys, that's pretty much all I wanted to show you. I wanted to show you an i3 running at 5.1 gigahertz. I'll give it that. It's running at 5.1 gigahertz with some 6400 DDR5, not exactly cutting edge DDR5. And an RTX 4080. Running with frame generation on it still looks really, really good. And yeah, just buttery smooth. Alright guys, I hope this video was helpful to anybody out there who kind of wanted to see the demonstration of, you know, what frame generation is possible. In my previous video, I showed a single P core with all the E cores. Now we're showing just 4 cores and 8 threads, no E cores, and an i3, something you wouldn't think of being able to drive these frames, but no problemo for frame generation. All right, peace out, guys. Catch you next one.